At 46, life was good. We were set in our careers, comfortable home life, and always planning on our next adventure. It wasn't until life threw us a curveball. On August 3rd, 2023, my wife Debbie was diagnosed with stage 4 cervical cancer, and our simple world came to a halt. Reality never sunk in. We lived in shock most of the month, and before we could understand her new life, she was gone. Welcome to 46 and Widowed. I'm your host, Mr. Paul, where I'll focus each month on what I've learned and continue to learn on my grief journey, in hope to help myself and help others, and how I rely on life, love, and family to get through each day. So let's begin.
Welcome, everybody. As I said, my name is Mr. Paul. I just wanted to start by introducing myself and give some background as to why I decided to go this route of my grief journey. When I became a widower, which is still very hard to consider myself a widower because I still don't feel like that. I still feel married. I still love my wife, even though she's not here. So it's hard to consider myself a widower, even though that is what I am. It's not something I expected at this stage of life. When we speak of widowhood or think of widowhood, it's usually, when we're in our 70s or 80s, when we've been married 60 plus years, not being widowed in our mid to early 40s. And that's where I'm finding myself. And I'm also questioning is what is out there for those that are 46 or younger to deal with being widowed. And I've went looking and I've done a lot of research and I found plenty of information on widows and what widowhood is, which is very common to look up, but there was nothing really focused on a men's perspective of widowhood. When I went out, I found men's groups, grief groups, all very helpful, and I had joined some and I've been engaged in a lot of them. But most of the time, it eventually turned into how do I start dating again? How do I start this next chapter in my life where I'm not alone? And honestly, that's the furthest thing from my mind right now. What I'm trying to do is figure out how am I going to cope with this new lifestyle that I find myself in and still function not only for myself, but for my son. He has really been my focus for the past year, almost year and a half. And it's not because I'm trying to avoid the grief, it's that I have to still function as a father while I'm grieving for my wife. And so sometimes I have to push that grief aside and make sure that he's all right, that I continue to take care of him, and then also find some time to deal with the grief that comes. I have to tell myself, okay, you lost your wife of 15 years. What do you do now? What are you going to do now? So, a little of my professional background, I am a professional counselor. So, you would figure that this would be an easy process for me to do, which it's not because we make the worst clients ourselves. But some of the things that I would tell my clients, some of the things that I've actually said in grief groups and have explained to them is we need to talk about it. You have to let those feelings out. You need to talk about the highs, the lows, you know, everything that you can't hold in has to come out. And eventually, that is where I find myself, you know, taking my own words into action. You know, early on, I think it was like 4 months out, I was still struggling with the process of the grief. I actually questioned myself, am I grieving right? I don't find myself, wanting to stay in bed or, crying my eyes out. I do now. I mean, that comes naturally now. But at the very beginning, I was like, what? I don't think I'm doing this right, or I am avoiding something. So I sought out a counselor um, through work, and I visited with them. I started the process. I was trying to figure out what is my day to day going to look like now that I still have to get up, I still have to go to work, I still have to take care of my son, I still need to take care of home, and yet still take that moment where all of a sudden the waves of grief. just come in and take control of the day, take control of the moment, even, and it's always these thoughts and memories and um, moments that come and they are flooding. The replaying of the moment we found out she was sick, the moment she passed away, the replaying of the funeral, replaying of all those little things, all those little moments that we shared privately that nobody else knows about. And yet they hit like a tsunami and in these big waves of emotions that can leave us crushing. That's when I find myself crying at night. That's where I find myself having to take a moment to just step away from wherever I am. And it can be anywhere. It could be at work, it can be with family, it could be here at home. It just hits, the memories flood in, and I have to try to cope with those at the moment. There are several times where I am taking my son to daycare in the morning and we're listening to the radio and a song comes on, and the song is just spot on to some emotion, some memory, and I'm trying to drive, I'm trying not to cry. My son's in the back in his car seat laughing and playing. I don't want to show him that I'm crying, and it's just, I have to let it go. I have to let the tears come. We can't hold it in. And as a counselor, I know that. We know that as a process of grieving, because if not, then it does turn into other symptoms. We become angry, we become resentful. And I do have to say, I did go through, I believe, the whole process of the steps of grief. I think I started grieving for Debbie long before she passed, because everything was starting to show up, and I had a lot of time to myself while she was in the hospital, while we were traveling back and forth trying to figure out this new life, that I think I started grieving way before she had even passed. So, by sharing all this, I was hoping to get what else I'm missing. I still am grieving. I still have this process to go through. I know there's part of me has accepted her loss, but it's still very raw and very emotional at times. This past a week, we went on a vacation with the in-laws, and excuse me, we had gone to a place that we have always gone before, and the moment we got there, it was emotional. I think I had to step away a couple of times because all of a sudden the memories of her being there with us flooded in. We were by the coast. I mean, we were in the parking lot. We had just gotten there. We hadn't been there but 5 minutes, and I was already tearing up because I knew she wasn't there. Later in the week, again, we were on the pier where my son was learning to fish. Again, hit wave of emotions because she wasn't there watching them. So I think that's where I struggle a lot, is that I know she's gone, but I'm hurting because she's missing out. She's missing out on her son. She's missing out on things that are going on in the family. I think that's where I struggle the most right now. So again, let's talk it out. That's what I'm planning to do with this podcast. So a little bit about me and Debbie. We have a funny relationship because we were married 15 years, and at her funeral, I remember standing there during the vigil eulogy, and I stood up, and that was a shock in itself because most times you don't speak. And I talked about our relationship, and I said, we were married 15 years, but we lived a lifetime. And for those that knew us, you know, we have been friends forever. When she would talk about where we met and people would ask, how did y'all start dating? She would say we met in the playpen. We have been friends since we were little. Our parents have been friends. We grew up together. We had been in and out of each other's lives um, throughout the years. But it wasn't really until our late 20s, early 30s that life, fate, God, whatever you want to call it, kind of brought us back together. But at the same time, we were still just friends. That's the biggest thing that we usually joked about was that we are just friends. We are the compadres kids. This is just platonic. It's nothing more than that. But yet, whenever we needed to go somewhere during that time, whether it was a function, a wedding, we were each other's date. We just called each other up, said, hey, this is what we're doing this weekend. Let's go. Or we would do that for the weekends as well. Our friends lived in San Antonio and she was off. So we were like, let's go to San Antonio. And we went out, Of course, to everybody else, our friends or family were like, yeah, y'all are lying. Just say y'all are a couple, get it over with. I don't see why y'all are fighting fate. So when we did finally decide to get together, we started to notice things change. Um, I would ask her, I was like, when did you know that the feelings of friendship were no longer there, but more romantic? And I would always joke with her about, oh, well, you just liked the way I looked in my tuxedo. Her feelings started changing at my older brother's wedding. Apparently, she saw me in the black tuxedo, and something changed. To me, that night, I was so intoxicated that I missed every cue that she had ever given me about flirting or anything that she thought more of just friendship. For me, it was probably years later because my brother was already living in one of the houses that he lived in. And we had gone up there, me and my younger brother and his wife, and we went for the weekend. And we had gone out to the mall, I believe it was, and the girls had gone off to one of the stores. We had gone off to another. We were waiting for them. And then as they were walking up to us, I don't remember which brother it was. I just remember them saying, here come the Flores wives. And something just clicked. It just seemed right. Okay, so that happened. Two things happened. My brother's wedding, this thing at the mall. It still took years before we even acknowledged that we had feelings for each other. So we just played that off. We just said, no, we're just good friends. We don't want to ruin anything. When we finally decided to get into a relationship, become a couple, we talked about it, that we were going to keep it a secret. We said, let's give ourselves 6 months, see how this works. If 6 months we're still together, things are good, then okay, we'll start telling everybody. And a lot of that had to do with that we were scared. We've been best friends, good friends. We were starting to date into this new area of our lives, but there was so much connected. Had something gone on, had forbid that our relationship didn't work, we would have ruined our friendship, the relationship with our friends, the relationship with our parents' friendship. So there was a lot to think about. And when looking back, I think we were just fooling ourselves to think that we were all that important. So when 6 months passed, things were going good. We decided to finally tell everybody. We were all excited. Like, here we go. We're going to come out to the family that we've been a couple for 6 months. And we finally did. And there was no applause. There was no big, oh, I'm so excited. It was more of, We've known all this time, and it's about damn time that y'all told us. So we weren't good liars. We couldn't keep things secret. We were just too obvious that we were more than just friends at that time. So we dated, I believe it was like we did 6 months, and then that's when we told everybody. I think we dated another 5 months, and then sometime we started talking about marriage. And it just seemed right. It came up in conversation. We talked about it. Um, we knew that that's what we both wanted, and we started the slow process of like, okay, so if we do this, of course, my wife is very detailed and plans everything out. So it takes a while until she gets it right, and then she's like, okay, let's do this. So being that she was, she had it planned out as to how I was going to propose, where I was going to propose, when it was going to get done. And I was like, no, this is something bigger than just some plan. This has to be spontaneous. This has to be a surprise. I am not going to play along with this planned out proposal. Kind of loses the romance a little bit. So it was funny because that Christmas, she had decided, let's go to San Antonio, let's go have supper, let's go down to the Riverwalk, get on the boat, see the lights. And I was like, oh, okay, here we go. I know what she's thinking. And we go, we have a wonderful time. We're walking, we're taking pictures along the Riverwalk. We get off the boat and we start walking, and she comes to the area that's well known for, getting married on the river. People propose in this area. Yeah, it was all set up. It was the perfect hallmark moment. And she started talking about, when we get married and when you propose. So I knew she was expecting me to do that at that time, because that was her plan. Was that I was going to propose here on the Riverwalk in this specific area where she wanted. And I was like, I'm not playing. One, I didn't have a ring with me at all, so I couldn't really propose. So that kind of helped me on my side. But I didn't want it to be planned out. I wanted it to be spontaneous, like I said. And during that conversation, I told her that night, he was like, getting proposed to on major holidays is so cliche. It's not something you want to do because, if something happens in the relationship, you ruin all your holidays because of this one relationship. And I was just playing it up to say, I'm not doing it today. So let's not get your hopes up too high. She didn't talk to me the rest of the ride home that night because she was upset because I didn't propose. So fast forward, I knew we were going to get married. I had to get a ring. I got the ring that she wanted. She had picked it out. I just went to get it. Then I had to decide when I was going to do this. And of course, at the same time, I was like, we're not going to do this on major holidays. And so she bought into that. And then I decided to propose on a major holiday. I proposed on Valentine's Day. And it was spontaneous, exactly as I wanted. All I remember is that once I asked her to marry me, she started laughing. She was so nervous that I had finally done it, that that we were being serious now, caught her off guard, which is what I wanted. And of course she said yes. And then she kind of got after me and said, you were calm all night. You didn't say anything. I couldn't even sense you had this planned out. And I said, well, that was the point. I wanted to surprise you. I wanted it to be romantic. So of course, after she said yes and everything, we called the parents to meet at one of the houses so that we could talk and celebrate. And I had already told my parents prior to asking her that night. And I had told my brothers, and my younger brother that whole night was like, have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? He was texting, he was calling. It was like, have you done it yet? And I'm like, give me time. And when the time is right, I'll ask. So when we finally told everybody, it was again, it's about time. We've been waiting for this. I don't know why y'all are dragging your feet, but we were just doing it in our time, our way. And I think that's what made our relationship special was we weren't rushed. We wanted to do things our way. We had things planned. And of course, once we started wedding plans, I just had to sit there and say yes because she had already had it planned out. I think that first day that we sat and decided, okay, let's start planning out this wedding, she pulled out this binder that had like every idea that she had for decorations, for the gowns for the bridesmaids, to the tuxedo that I was going to wear. She had it all planned out. So it was just more of a function of getting it together, getting it done. And we got married in September of '08. And as it was a beautiful wedding. I remember it being very big. It was very loud. We both come from big families, so the place that we rented for the reception, we were having to pull out tables. We were having to pull out extra chairs because there was just so many people that attended to celebrate our love. So we were very grateful for that. And then after all of that was done, it's time to build the home. And we had very different living styles. I was a guy, I just throw clothes here or there. It didn't matter where it was, I'd pick it up later. She was very organized. Things go in a specific spot. If you clean, if you move something, make sure you put it back. Very OCD, or just very organized, I guess. Maybe not OCD. But it took us a while to adjust to that because, yeah, we had been dating, but we hadn't been living together. So now that we were living together, it was a whole adjustment that we had to go through. But one thing that I know that we always talked about, even before we got married, we got married by the church, so we had to go to classes and stuff like that. And I think that was probably one of the best things that we did before we got married because it made us talk about a lot of things that we hadn't really thought about. We had to sit there. I remember we had to talk about finances, like what were we bringing into the marriage? What were we hoping for the marriage? What were our plans for, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? And one of the biggest thing that they always talked about, and as a counselor, this is my biggest thing too for any couple marriage, is the communication has to be there. You have to be able to communicate with your spouse, with your loved one, your significant other, because if that isn't there, then it leaves room for interpretation, misunderstandings, arguments, and it just kind of snowballs from there. So when we were in that class, we talked about communicating, and we said, you know what, we have to be upfront. We have to talk about everything. We're not going to keep anything a secret. We're going to work through everything together. If there's a problem, we're going to back each other up. Number one thing, we'll back each other up. And that's how we pretty much lived our life and lived our marriage, was we talked about everything. If there was a decision to be made, we spoke about it. We would stay up sometimes at night just thinking of ideas. Okay, this is what we need to do. How are we going to do it? Even with finances, we need to pay for this. We need to pay for that. How can we do it? What can we pay off so that we can get what we need? And that's how our life was. And it worked. And it was wonderful. We were able to do a lot more than what we had intended to do. And there was one thing, though, that, because nobody's perfect, nothing's perfect. One struggle that we always had in our marriage was in fertilization. She couldn't have kids, we couldn't have kids. Something was always interfering with that. And I will do a podcast episode about this whole part of our lives and how we got through it. But at the end of all that, we had to tell each other, this cannot be the focus of our marriage. If God is wanting us to have a child, He will give us a child when He's ready. And that's how we dealt with the fertility issue, was that we were not going to focus on it. If it happened, it happened. If it didn't, it didn't. So we went on 14 years that way. Of course, year 15, our big adventure, that was our son. And that will be in a whole nother episode as well later on, because that story in itself is amazing as to what happened. So getting back to where we were, so our marriage was going well, things were good, our careers were set. She had been a nurse for 20 something years. She had finally decided to step away from bedside, and she went into school nursing. And I was a counselor for the hospital that we worked at here in town. So things were good, and then I believe it was after COVID, so it had to been like 22. She started to have complications. During COVID, she had gotten COVID. She was hospitalized. We got through that. But ever since then, she just wasn't the same health wise. There's all these things that were popping up that we found very strange, but we took care of them. We were able to get the help we needed. But it was late of 2022 when she started to notice pain on her right leg. She thought it was sciatic nerve. We would go to the doctors. They would look at it. They would give her medications. She would go to physical therapy, and it would subside, and she was able to manage the pain. And then it would return, and we did the same routine probably 3 or 4 times. She took the medicine. She did physical therapy. And every time it worked, or at least alleviated the pain. But then we also started to notice, okay, you're starting to lose some weight, and this wasn't like just little. It was starting to be noticeable, like, okay, something else is going on. When she was in the pain, when she had the pain, she didn't really feel like eating. She was tired. And we kind of said, okay, well, let's give it some time, see what happens. Physical therapy has always worked. The same routine we've done has helped. We left it at that. So when we had our son, she took maternity leave, and she spent time with him. She spent like the 6 months. School was about to end, so she took the last month of school, went all through summer. She was getting ready to go back in August, and that was August of 23, and the pain came back again. And this time her leg was getting swollen. The pain was unbearable. Physical therapy no longer was working. And, she was so uncomfortable that at times I would find her asleep on the floor, and I'm like, what are you doing? And she would be like, this is the only place my leg doesn't hurt if I'm laying here on the floor. And I said, no, this is too much. We need to go check this out. There's something else going on. So she said, school's starting. Let me start school, and then we can figure this out. So she went to work that first day of that semester. And I remember she waking up, and her leg was swollen, and she was in pain. And she kind of said, I'll get through this. I'll just take the medication, and I'll work through this pain. But if by this afternoon, if I can't stand it, then we'll go to the emergency room. We'll figure this out. So of course she went to work. Her leg swelled up again. The pain was just unbearable. And she said, you know what? She had called me that during the day, and she goes, "You know what? I'm gonna have to go to the emergency room when I get out." And I said, "All right, just call me when you get out. I will go pick you up and we'll take you in." So we got to the emergency room, checked in and stuff, told them the whole rundown of what had been going on in the past. The sciatic nerve pain. Um, she knew a lot of the nurses and the doctors because she used to work at the hospital. So they kind of knew the story already as to her situation. And the doctor that night, that afternoon said, "You know what, let's do some more tests. We do this, let's do some scans, let's do some blood work. Something else is going on because you've been dealing with this for so long." So they did the scans, they did the blood work. We sat around for what seemed like hours, which, um, joking around, it's like, "Okay, what are we going to do for supper tonight when we get home? Your mom has our son, we need to go get him, make sure he goes to sleep on time. What are we going to do this weekend? We have nothing planned. Maybe we should go to the aquarium in San Antonio or something." And then all of a sudden I remember the room getting really quiet. That silence before the bad news comes. And in walked the doctor and the nurses. I think it was like two nurses. And their face, I would say, said it all. He goes, "We did the scans, we've looked at them, and we found a tumor. And it looks cancerous, and we're going to have to send you to San Antonio." We sat there for a little bit until I think we're like, "What?" Like, "No, we're here for sciatic nerve. You're in the wrong room." We're not here for a tumor. We're here for her pain in her leg. And, the nurses that she knew, kind of just nodded and like, "Yeah, this is true." Or, so we sat there in shock. We're like, "No, this isn't happening. This is not what we're here for. This is not what we're expected. This isn't our life." And yet, here we were now. She was sent to San Antonio, um, where she then spent about a month in the hospital, because of where the tumor was and stuff. She had all these other complications that had to be addressed even before they could even get to the tumor. They had to take care of all these other things, and it was just seemed like one thing on top of another, that it was like, oh my goodness, it's like, this isn't happening. Now, for where we lived to San Antonio was about 84 miles one way. So I spent a lot of time traveling back and forth because we had our son at home. I had her in the hospital. So me and my in-laws were like trading in and out so that we weren't disrupting our son's routine, but I was also being able to take care of Debbie and be with her while she was in the hospital. So in that time that I was traveling back and forth, I had, my moments, as to trying to figure out, where did life take its turn? How did this now become part of our story? So, and that's where I said, I think, is when I started grieving way before she passed. Because I would spend time, like an hour, 2 hours on the road, and I was either crying, I was either yelling at God, like, "Why are you doing this to us? We just have a son, and, take this from us. Why are we being punished?" And there was nothing I can do. We would talk when we were there at the hospital, like we were trying to make sense. At one point she was like, "This can't be true. It's a wrong, diagnosis. They've messed up." And, every doctor we spoke to, said the same thing. And I think when it finally hit us that, okay, this is our reality now, you have cancer, is when the doctor, her primary doctor, the oncologist, came in and spoke to her and said, you really need to start thinking about hospice. Well, that was not a good thing for him to say to her because she was on fire. She was like, "Oh, I don't think so. That is not a word that we use. I'm going to fight this. I am too young. I am a mother. I have a young son at home with my husband, and we are not going to talk about hospice. I am not dying." And I remember her calling because the doctor would show up like very early in the morning, and that morning just so happened to be during the switch of my in-laws and myself, and she was just infuriated, you know. And of course, at the time, she didn't really want to tell me that's what he said or that was a conversation. But later on, I ran into him, in passing while I was going back to visit with her or stay with her. That I ran into him in the hallway, and I said, "Hey, you said this, and that was very uncool of you to do that with nobody else in the room. She was by herself, and you talked to her about hospice." And of course, he kind of apologized, kind of like, it was just something I need to talk about with her. And I said, "Well, she's not going to do hospice. We're going to fight this." And being that he was like a really good doctor, like the main specialist, we could tell a little that he was like, "Oh, okay, here we're gonna waste some time trying to cure this lady that I'm telling her she needs hospice," and we weren't gonna buy it. She was gonna fight this cancer. So they decided that the way they were going to do this is to start chemotherapy. Um, Debbie has always been very sensitive to medications, so it was always a concern as to would her body be able to handle the chemo treatment. And believe me, it was a very big ordeal. They had tried, I believe, twice to start, and she hadn't even gone to the chemo medicines. She was already having reactions um, to the other medications, like the PrEP medications. And I remember the physician being frustrated by that second time, and he said, this is the only treatment we can give her, and if she's not able to handle it, then there's no other option. And she sat there and she goes, "No, we're going to try one more time to see if I can do it." And that's what we did. The physician, oncologist, said, "You know what? I'm going to bring one of my nurses that's well um, versed in all these treatments. I'm going to have her go through it with you. We're going to move you to the ICU in case there are complications. There'll be somebody there, their staff's there ready to help, and we'll see how you do." And I remember the night before, that oncologist nurse said, "You know what? Eat whatever you want, because it's probably going to be like the last good meal you're going to have once you start chemo." And of course, I went and got her the food she wanted, and she enjoyed it. And she's like, "Oh, that has never tasted so good. We've been in the hospital the whole month eating hospital food." She enjoyed that night, and then we got ready for the treatment. And they decided to do it at night so that, one, uh, she could rest, she could sleep during the process, but also, two, if she was to have any complications, there was less patients there, so they would be able to attend to her easier. So I am very thankful. We were very blessed to have that oncology nurse with us that night. She was very compassionate, very understanding of the situation, and she talked us through the whole process. And she sat there over 8 hours. She was over her shift by the time we were done. She had stayed late. She had stayed with us and walked walked us through the whole process. And again, we were up all night, and me and the nurse, as Debbie slept and she took the chemo treatment. And at the end of the treatment, they decided, this is the process we're going to have to do every treatment that she has so that her body can take the medications. So every treatment now lasted 8 hours, eat every 3 weeks. So what we had to go, she had to go to. So it was a whole day thing, and it was a slow process, but it worked. She was able to take on the treatment. She was able to adjust to the medications, and then since it worked, the doctor was like, "Okay, we can discharge you, send you home. You do seem to have a little infection, which is usually a part of the chemo treatment, so we want to keep you another 2 weeks." And she was like, "No, no, no. I don't have 2 weeks. I need to get home." And of course, they were like, why are you in such a rush? You've been here a month already. And she goes, "My son is going to turn 1 next week, and I have to be home. I can't miss his first birthday." So, of course, the staff was like, "Oh my goodness, this lady, she is here dying of cancer, and she's still very demanding." It was just her nature. And of course, she got her way. So she was home maybe 2, 3 days before our son's birthday. And we celebrated. It was very low key. She was still not physically well enough to be with others. So we decided, let's just do immediate family. Our parents, our siblings, nieces, nephews, and nobody else, because we hadn't told anybody. That was one thing that I always found odd, but I know why, because Debbie was a very private person. But we never told anybody that we were in the hospital, that she had cancer that whole month. We didn't want everybody to know that this was going on. We didn't want the sympathy, oohs and ahs, and "oh, we're sorry." And, she wasn't wanting that attention. She just wanted to say, "Okay, let us make sense of this and then figure it out and get the treatments going." So by the time we got home for our son's first birthday, she was obviously physically ill. You could tell that she was been in the hospital. You could tell she was something was going on. And before we left, that oncology nurse said, "You've had your first treatment. In a couple of weeks, your hair is going to start falling out. Just kind of comb it out." And she gave her all the things to do for that. And sure enough, within a week after, or a couple of days after the birthday party, she started to lose her hair. And that was right before the holidays started. So we were up one night talking, and I told her, we're going to need to tell people. I know you don't want to. I know you want to keep this private. But we're about to hit the holidays, and because our families are so big and involved with each other, we celebrate. And they're going to want to know. They're going to start asking what's going on, because it's noticeable. You've lost a lot of weight. Your hair's falling out. We need to be honest now with them and just let them know. So we decided, or she decided, to let the family, that it was all right now to let the extended family know, like the aunts and uncles and cousins, those that were close to us, her friends, and she did tell her family through a text message. I remember her saying, "I'm just going to write this out, read it. What do you think? Does it cover everything I want to say? Because this is what I want to send them, because I don't want to talk to them. I don't want the tears. I don't want the sad looks. I just need to let them know that this is what's going on, and we're working to figure this out and get better." And, they're the only ones we actually told on that extended side of in person was our friends. And they were very mad when we did because they lived in San Antonio or in that area and they were there the whole time. And yet we were there in the hospital. She was struggling, fighting for her life. And we never once said, hey, here we are. This is what's going on. Come sit with us. Come be with us. But that was just Debbie. She wanted this private moment. And looking back, I sometimes think, was this moment that she wanted was for just us? This time together so that we could talk until we could get things in order. So when we did finally tell our friends, okay, like I said, they were very supportive. Everyone was very supportive. We didn't get the sympathy things, comments or the sympathy looks. Everybody was like supportive. Okay, we're going to fight this. We're all going to fight together. And that's how we went for 2-3 months. Because she would go to treatment every 3 weeks, and I think they had said, there's we're going to do 8 treatments. This is what the plan is, and then after that, we'll see where we are with the tumor and go from there. So now that we were home and we were adjusting to getting her better, getting her through treatment, of course my mentality as a husband was, how am I going to fix this? I need to fix this. I need to get her well. I need to get her healthy. That is my job. I am to protect my family. I am to help her get better. And there was no way to do that. I wasn't able to cure her of her cancer, but that man's instinct, I guess, said, I have to do this. And since I couldn't do that, I figured, well, let me be the more optimistic one. Let me talk about things of the future, what we're going to do, what we're going to plan. And sometimes those things just never fell right because she was always sick. She was always exhausted. She was going through the treatments. And sometimes she would just play along with me. I think I wish she would have just told me, Paul, stop. This is what's going on. And of course, on the backside of all that, I was doing my own research. It's like, okay, let me research cervical cancer and what's the survival rate and what's this and what's that. And of course, with the stage 4 that she had, the survival rate was very low. And we knew that. We had that in the back of our mind. That was the same conversation with the physician on the hospice. But we pushed that aside. We didn't want to focus on that. We weren't going to end this life focusing on death or illness. And I do have to say that one of the hardest parts of that time was watching the person you love disappear. She had lost that bubbly, joyful, go get 'em attitude and liveliness that she had, and just see her slowly fade away. As I said, she was exhausted most of the time. She just wanted to sleep. Her body was just slowly wearing out, and there was nothing I could do, like I said. So as we got to, the 7th treatment, I think it was, I said, okay, we're at the end. We're almost here. This is number 7. Things are working fine. You look good. You're looking a little better. Next is 8, and then you get to ring the bell. At the end of each cancer treatment, they get to ring the bell that they have completed treatment. And, she was like, no, I don't want to ring it. I don't think I'm going to get to ring it. And of course, it was just something she said, and we're like, well, you're still going to do it. If not, I'm going to ring it for you. So we went into the eighth treatment, the final treatment, and before the treatment, she does blood work, she does all these things to prepare for it, and then they would start the treatment. And the nurse came in and said, well, we have good news and we have bad news. We're like, we don't need any more bad news. So she goes, well, you have an infection. Your blood work came back, your white cells are up, there's an infection, so we're not going to be able to do treatment today. But the good news is the tumor has shrunk. Treatment has been working. It looks as though if with this next treatment that it would shrink hopefully a little bit more, and then we could go in and do surgery to remove it. And, in my head, it's like, we won. She didn't see it the same way, I guess. She goes, all right, I'm disappointed that I can't do treatment today, but, we'll reschedule, we'll get this done. So that we drove home that day, a little disappointed that we weren't able to do the treatment, but excited that there was this possibility of now having surgery to remove the tumor. And she goes, you know what? This weekend, I want to barbecue. I want you to cook some stuff on the grill, and it'd just be us, just me, you, and our son. Just spend the weekend low key together. And so that's what we did. We spent that weekend barbecuing, enjoying a meal, and it felt like old times, like before she was sick. And then the day after that, I think it was the Monday, she had come home from work, and her parents had already left because they would come stay with her during the day and spend time with her. And she was up cooking supper. She was washing, she was cleaning, and I thought, oh, here we go. Again, we won. She's feeling better now. And the next day, she was gone. So the day that she passed, I replayed, I think, 100 times that whole first month. I needed answers. I needed to figure out what went wrong, what happened, because I wasn't here. I had woken up that morning late. My son had had a bad night that night. He couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. So I would toss and turn as well with them. And I woke up, got ready for work, got our son ready for daycare, reminded her, hey, you need to get up. Your parents will be here in a little bit, about an hour, to take you to your doctor's appointment. She was like, no, I didn't have a good night. I'm too tired. Let me just sleep a little longer. And then I'll get up when you leave. I said, all right. So we finished. I got everything ready. We're getting ready to take off. I kissed her goodnight, told her I'll see her this afternoon. Call me after the doctor's appointment to let me know what they said. And she kissed our son on the forehead. And we left. And within an hour, I got a call from my mother-in-law. And she said, you need to go home. Something's going on. So in my mind, I was like, okay, she already said that she wasn't feeling well. And the normal routine sometimes after chemo was she would get really sick, go back to the hospital for a week or so, come back home. So that was what I thought in my head. It's like, okay, she's sick. She wasn't feeling well. We'll just do the normal routine. But something else hit, I guess, when I got into the truck to come home. And this time it felt different than before. And I remember driving home and kind of yelling out loud, like, "You better not have left us. This is not what we had planned. You were supposed to be there this afternoon. You better not have left us." And as I turned the corner to our neighborhood, the ambulance is there as I expected. And I got down, and as I was walking up to the house, that's when reality hit, or I finally knew what was going on. Because my father in law walked out of the house, and behind him was a deputy. He asked who I was. I kind of explained, "This is my house. This is my wife's inside." My father in law was like, "Yes, this is him." And I kind of pushed past him to get inside the house. I had to see her. I had to find out. I had to know. And I remember there was another officer inside, and he was like, "You don't want to go in there. You don't want to see this." And I was like, "No, I need to see her. I need to know." And I did, and she was gone. She had passed away. And then all of a sudden, it was just this big commotion. There was people in and out of the house. There were officers. There was the medical uh, coroner. There was the funeral people. And they were all asking questions. And, you need to do this. And here's my card. And asking all these 100 questions as to what was going on prior to her passing. And all I remember saying was, "I need to make phone calls. I need to call my parents. I need to go get my son." And I broke down, and one of the I can't remember what his title was, but he kind of pulled me to the other room and was like, "Take your moment. You need to calm and make sense of this, and then go on. I know it's a lot." And we talked for a little bit, and I said, I can't believe this is happening." And then he went on to explain, "Okay, this is going to be the next process." So by the time I was able to make the phone calls, call my parents, call my brother, everybody was here, and the medical coroner and the funeral director had said, "Okay, we're going to remove her from the house. This is what the process is. You get to say your last goodbye. You get to let everybody that you want to say bye to her." And they gave me a moment with her. And I remember kissing her goodbye. And I just told her, "I'll see you soon." After that, everything else was a blur. You know, I'm still get choked up when I talk about that day. So I think that is part of why I feel I need to do this podcast, is to get some of this emotion out, because I do hold a lot in. I have always been one to do that. I can take all this stress, I can take all this pressure from everything, but I tend to just kind of close up and hold it all in until it bursts out, and then it's not very good when it does. So that is one reason why I've wanted to do this podcast, so that I could express this stuff out, to get it out of my system and let everybody that I know that I'm okay. I am grieving as the best of all of them, but this is my journey and I need to go through this. And I am so grateful for the support of my family, the friends, my coworkers, everybody that's involved in my life have been blessings, and have been very helpful in me processing all this. And I feel that our son was a godsend. So, not that I put a lot of this on him. He is like the light in the shadows, in the dark. His smile, his laugh, can make all this go away. So again, this is why I decided this is what I was going to do. Was going to be my process, and talk about all the different things that I've gone through since her passing. It's now been a year and 4 months since she's passed, and it's still hard. I'm still finding things that I have to take care of that are still emotional. Whether it was, you know, buying the stone for the grave, to what do I do with her clothes, her her 100 shoes that she has, and the 100 purses that she would collect. What do I do with those things? And I don't want to get rid of them. When is the right time? I still wear my wedding ring. Am I supposed to take it off? When do I take it off? All these things, 100 questions that are just pertaining to me, but then also all the things that I have to take care of that are more material, like the house, the vehicles, the bank accounts, all these other things that you really don't think about until somebody passes. So I'll talk about those type of things and the way I got through those, um, and share the experiences that I've had. And like I said, it is in hope to help not only myself, but to help anybody else that is going through this same process on their journey. So before I end this episode, I wanted to share two things. Well, the last two things that Debbie had told me and that I still hold on to every day. One was when we were becoming parents. As I said, we had fertility issues. We were finally going to become parents. And she would tell me, Paul, I love you, but it just can't be the two of us. There has to be more than just us. And that process, like I said, I will discuss in an episode later on as to how our son came into our life. And the other one was her mantra, I guess, while she was sick, while all this was going on. And I was just trying to be so optimistic about everything and plan for a future that I envisioned. And she goes, Paul, just take it day by day. Stop looking so far ahead. Just take it day by day. We'll get through this. I know we'll get through this. So just slow down. So that is one thing that I have continued to do, tried to do, is to take this just day by day, to get through this grief, to deal with her loss, and focus on what is my next step. So again, thank you for joining me on my premiere episode. Like I said, each month I'll talk about different stages of the widowhood and what I found, the ups and downs, and find ways to celebrate her life while my heart is still trying to heal. So you can catch 46 and Widowed Life, Love and Family on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and any other podcast programming sites that you have. So again, thank you for joining me, and God bless, and I will see you next episode.